in the marketplace of ideas. And you know what, let's both sort of put our comprehensive ideas of the good out there and see, if we can negotiate that. But this kind of neutrality towards all different opinions out there, and talking about rights to academic freedom or rights to freedom of speech. I think rights language very often impoverishes the discussion. When we talk about rights, we're really papering over some important differences about our views about what is good and what's the common good here. So, I think you can't say absolutely everything because some things are just absolutely contrary to the human good. I'm Mary Imparata, and I'm currently the chair of the politics department and an assistant professor here at Belmont Abbey. And I came here after teaching for a year at DeSales University, and then prior to that, was working on my PhD at Rutgers University, which I did in political science, and really kind of went into that from being a full-time mom, actually. So that's what I did in between graduating Harvard and getting my PhD. So yeah, just original native New Yorker and someone who's always been interested in current events and politics and reading and writing about it. So I think I'm just really enjoying teaching. It's kind of one of my favorite things to do.
And I'm Ross Douthat, and we know each other from way back. But I am an opinion columnist for the New York Times. I have been there kind of astonishingly for 14 years. So I write about the news, but in an opinionated way. I write about politics, culture, religion, technology, foreign affairs. It's it's sort of a broad sweep of things. And we have 4 children. And I'm very pleased to be here. I find generally that the opportunity to come and both give talks but also talk to people at colleges is one of the best aspects of my job, and a place like Belmont is a particularly excellent place to have those conversations given my own views and interests. The simplest way to describe the change is that journalism has been somewhat reinvented and somewhat destroyed by the internet. And the changes, so I was in college from 1998 to 2002, so the changes in the 20 years between then and now, have something to do with politics, something to do with changing ideological trends, those kind of things. But fundamentally, journalism has gone through this technological shock.
So I'm often trying to get my students to be really plugged into the news. And one of the things that we've discovered is that we have to sort of have them assess their source. So whatever they're looking up, it's like no more this pretended neutrality. And I'll put up on the screen sort of a projection of the spectrum of, okay, well, Daily Beast, Mother Jones, what side is that on? Or if they don't know, try to explain, right? And okay, Real Clear Politics, Politico, where's the center here? And I feel like when we were coming up, it was almost like, well, you could read the whatever New York Times as a paper of record. And now, I think we put New York Times firmly pretty much in the center left, and so it's just getting them to kind of not just read things and soak up information, but understand the perspective, where they're coming from. So having to be kind of informed consumers of the news. And I guess that's overall a good thing, because the neutrality always was pretended to a certain extent, and we have people talking about the mainstream media wants you to think this, and I think that the monopoly has been broken to a certain extent. The mainstream media has so many different voices kind of competing. When it comes to students, if they cite something, and they always have to think about where are they getting that from and what perspective did that come from. So that's how it's kind of impacted how we think about information here. We're always talking about information literacy.
We've ended up back in a college town, New Haven, where I have a certain amount of contact with Yale and students there. And my basic impression is that when we were in college, elite education was very, very, very sort of purely achievement-oriented. It was sort of the high tide of meritocracy. You had this sense in the late 1990s that Alan Greenspan had figured out all economic matters and all great political debates were in the past, and the important thing was to, sort of become a consultant and maximize value. And it was soulless in certain ways. But that was very powerful. My sense is that the last 20 years, some of what we think of as sort of wokeness and progressivism on college campuses is itself a reflection of dissatisfaction with that mentality, right? Mm-hmm. And there's, this strong strain now that's basically saying, no, we have to, remoralize higher education and figure out why we're doing this and so on. But at elite schools, it usually takes the form of, pretty far left politics. And it's also, this is the other shift I've seen, also linked to sort of kind of collapsing mental health. Like there've always been big mental health problems on college campuses. It's a transitional time in people's lives. People struggle. But I think, and I've talked to a lot of people who confirm this, there's just a lot more anxiety, depression, medication, all of these kind of things, at least in elite schools, even pre-COVID. COVID obviously created its own set of issues, but even pre-COVID than there was when you and I were there. So there's a lot more, I'd say there's a lot more sort of, it's still sort of hyper-meritocratic, but there's a lot more unhappiness with meritocracy, mostly expressed through left-wing politics and anxiety and personal unhappiness. What do you think?
I get the sense that when we were in college, there was sort of still this kind of modus vivendi liberalism that prevailed, where like, I may not agree with you, but you can still have your opinion and I'll respect it. And now it seems like it's much more doctrinaire in its liberalism. And so I think both of us spoke to a young man who is trying to revitalize the conservative paper that we were part of at Harvard, the Harvard Salient. And I think what he's doing is very much sort of underground, whereas we could openly publish a bi-weekly paper and write all kinds of things that weren't very popular, but we were allowed to do that without getting like drummed out of campus. And
right, they're doing it pseudonymously.
Right, they're not even using their names, and they slip it under people's doors. Like we used to just have it out in the dining halls for people to take. I mean, people would probably.
I always got a little anxious doing the dorm room deliveries. Occasionally, it wasn't, but yes, I agree that it's changed.
Yeah, there are certain, I guess, speakers some campuses can't have, and we would have a variety of speakers. It just seems like now that campuses have fully embraced sort of progressive politics as the ideology, and not much room for anything else. And then the other thing I noticed was that, and I think I've heard you say this, that almost the world was our oyster. We could study anything and we'd be okay, and we didn't have to worry about, the economy was going to take care of us. But students now, one with like the value of a college degree being questioned, but also like their parents are like, okay, well, we're going to pony up for this education, but you better get a good job at the end of it. So then you're trying to convince students to study things like the humanities, or why you have to read Plato's Republic when you just want to get a job in finance, and you're just trying to make that connection to like a real world application. And so they're very much driven, I think, by the cost. I hear them talk about that all the time. They're worried about their loans and what job they're going to get, and they just want to maybe graduate early so they can start working. And I never really thought about that kind of pressure. It just seemed like it's all going to work out, and the rising tide lifts all boats. It's just, and there's a lot more pressure on them now, I think, in that sense. At the Abbey, we're doing something a little bit different because we have this kind of developed core curriculum and a certain worldview, obviously, in the Catholic and Benedictine liberal arts tradition. So we see our mission as really trying to impact the culture. And I think a lot of higher ed sees that as well, whether they admit that or not. And in a lot of ways, it's not always impacted for the better, right, what higher ed is doing. So in some ways, we're fighting an uphill battle, but we're really trying to form our students to be good leaders and public servants and hopefully help change the culture, I think. So it's a really high, it's a high calling for sure. It just has to be done well. And I think, journalism is probably under a similar maybe ideological slant to some extent, and has similar responsibilities to the nation.
So I'm an opinion journalist, right? I write a column. I'm expected to sort of wear my opinions on my sleeve, and in that sense, I see that part of journalism definitely as being in not the same business as higher education, but a related business where you're trying to have serious arguments. I have a certain set of ideas that I'm committed to. They may change a little bit over the course of my career, but I'm trying to advance those ideas, and I'm trying to sort of, you could say, form my readers in, again, if not precisely my perspective, at least a certain perspective that's informed by my ideas, right? The best and most successful opinion journalist has something in common with the best kind of university, or for that matter, high school teacher. At the same time, just as higher ed has a responsibility, a sort of basic responsibility to the truth, I think there's real value in the part of journalism that I think has been weakened by all these trends, which is the part that really, is sincerely just trying to tell true stories about the world, like give you a baseline of what is actually happening. And obviously what's actually happening, your read of that will be refracted through ideology, and no one except God himself can have a sort of full spectrum sense of what's happening in the world. But the basic idea that citizens of a democratic society should have access to some sort of common understanding of just like literal, who, what, where, when, why, the basic journalistic questions, I think that's still important. And so I am an ideological journalist. I'm a fan of ideological journalism, but I think journalism has suffered from losing some of the foundation underneath that much more basic, like, I'm going to go out again to City Hall and figure out just what's happening here, independent of a political worldview.
At least from my perspective with students, sometimes you introduce a really controversial topic in the classroom and nobody wants to speak up because they don't want the other people to think that they're off the wall or something, right? They're like really concerned about their peers think. So they're kind of scared to jump out there or maybe get into a conflict with somebody. And so I try to like make it a safe space, if you will, for like people to share different opinions in a civil way. And what we've done here is work with Braver Angels for the last couple of semesters and have them come moderate debates on hot button topics that everybody tries to avoid. One was on gun control, another was on immigration. And it's just, I think students get so scared and like hands off those hot button topics that they just kind of unplug from politics. And it's like, if this was a more welcoming environment for all different opinions and people could share in a civil manner, I think that would be a good thing. So we're trying to encourage them, come out to the debates and like discuss this as just like one citizen to another. What do you think? Where are you coming from? What's your experience with, we started out in one class when we did a debate on gun control, and we started out with just talk to people one-on-one, person to person about your experience with guns. And like what was it like growing up? Did you have guns in the home? Where are you coming from with this? And let me get to know you as a person, as a human being, right? And then they gather together with 3 and 3, and I had them organized. I knew beforehand where they fell on the issue of gun control. So in a smaller group, then they talk, but they get to know each other as opposed to just knowing the ideas that you could tear apart anonymously on Twitter. So I think that's kind of what we're lacking, is like face-to-face personal interaction, and this sort of like social media fueled echo chamber, just attacking people anonymously is, it's a really turnoff for students when it comes to thinking about politics. I teach core classes, so students have to take my classes, and a lot of times their immediate reaction is like, cringe, I don't want to think about that. It's too uncomfortable. It's the kind of thing we don't talk about at the Thanksgiving table. So polarization when it comes to trying to have a discussion in the higher ed classroom has been a problem, I think.
I think Catholic and Christian identity have to have a complicated role in citizenship, right? I mean, I think there's a sort of a fundamental and obvious way in which Catholics and Christians are called to be good citizens, to seek the common good, even, of their neighbor, even regardless of the neighbor's religious beliefs, to sort of seek the best form of the American Republic, all of those things. But you do have to expect, it would be unusual, historically unusual, if tensions didn't exist in various ways between Catholic and Christian commitment and political values, both with society as a whole, also even with the coalitions that you're part of. I mean, the United States is a country of 330 million people, and even if you were just trying to set up a political party, forget the country as a whole, you're going to end up sort of navigating tensions, facing different kinds of moral compromises, all of these things that are sharp for everyone, but for people who believe, as Christians believe, that your primary loyalty lies elsewhere and above, you have to be aware of that. And there's, I think this is one of the, I'm not someone who thinks that, the decline of Christianity in the United States has been a good thing overall. I don't think that. I think it's been a bad thing. I think Christians should want to live in a largely Christian society, even if that entails certain hypocrisies and compromises and so on. But it is true that in the decline of Christianity, you've sort of exposed discomforts that people should have had all along.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's a thorny topic, and one of the things I've been troubled by is so often you find that people who are Catholic and Christian are living a bifurcated existence. They're citizens and they do one thing in that realm, and then they're believers, and they just keep their faith behind the church doors. And it's like, if we could have people be, not schizophrenic in that way, like live your citizenship and your faith together, right? And one should always be informing the other. But if there's a tension there, the one that holds sway is the one that is ordered towards the higher level, the spiritual. And so, it's always been troubling to me to hear politicians say, like, well, I believe that, that's how I worship on Sunday, and I believe that morally, but I can't impose that on other people, especially when it's a matter as grave as something like abortion. But I think to a certain extent, the American regime kind of encourages us to bracket our comprehensive conceptions of the good life or a religion. So to a certain extent, it's not that that fits in so easily into American citizenship, right? Sometimes it feels like it's appended. Other times it can be jettisoned, depending on what you need to do. And I myself have been trying to find that balance where you can be both a good citizen, and sometimes being a good citizen means being the best, Catholic or Christian that you can be, and, speaking truth to power, and even if it's religiously informed truth.